So hello everybody, and welcome to the second part of my three-part review of the Camel catalog. For those of you who didn't catch the first part, I spent years laboring under the misapprehension that only the first four Camel albums were really great, and the others were patchy at best, or maybe just totally uninteresting. But after years, I did eventually come to really appreciate everything that they've done. And this is just a little series I'm doing on why and what it is that makes some of those albums so easy to underrate. Now, in the comments for the last video, there was someone who said that he couldn't have enjoyed Camel when he was young. And I think I really understand why, and probably agree in my own case. They don't have the darkness and intensity and overt strangeness and flashiness of a lot of the other classic prog that I was really drawn to as a teenager or, in my early 20s. Instead, they have this very calm, gentle, kind of warm-hearted quality that really took me some maturity to appreciate. And I think that the albums that I'm going to be talking about today really bring out the best of that quality. So back in 2010, when I was initially going through all the Camel albums in a sequence and being kind of disappointed in a lot of them, this is one that actually made a pretty good impression right off the bat, and that I took to more easily than some of the other stuff that I've put around it on this part of the list. And I think the reason for that is that its virtues are more up front than some of the other middle period albums, right? Breathless, I Can See Your House From Here, those involve excellent playing and arrangement being put over what's sometimes middling material. Nude is so quiet and subtle that it's easy to just kind of miss the whole thing. Whereas Stationary Traveler, by comparison, is good in a way that is immediately obvious, right? This is as consistently effective as Latimer's really ever been at writing short-form, catchy songs with a legitimately compelling set of pop hooks. And while the playing and arrangement really contain almost nothing that you can trace back to the early days, aside maybe from an occasional guitar solo, the writing is very high quality, and this feels like a very coherent, cohesive work. I think a lot of that success can be attributed to the Cold War concept, right? Which gives the lyrical content a tension which is well matched by the sound. Like I said in my Peter Hamill review, this type of 80s production tends to result in a stiffness and a sort of martial rigidity that can be off-putting when you compare it to the more fluid style of the classic work. But here, I think that tone is actually a perfect match for the mood of anxiety and paranoia that runs through the writing of the album. Now, I recognize that some Camel fans may not be able to get around how complete the stylistic departure is here, but if you approach this less as a Camel album and more as, a Japan album with all the sexiness taken out, I think it actually succeeds remarkably well on those terms. So what this album tends to do is take relatively simple core songs, generally with a mood of melancholy and nostalgia, and extend them with solos and quiet instrumental sections and sound effects. And the effect that has is something with kind of the drifting tapestry quality of a dream, something where past and present and experience and memory interweave in a very free manner. So the title cut, for instance, starts with synthesizer and flute that evoke a perfect sense of haziness. And the song drifts between sections and moods in a way that's reminiscent of the unmoored quality of a dream. And, if it's not as dynamic as the old epics, then it sprawls in a very relaxing and comforting way. It's maybe the best long piece from the later end of their career. Now, that stylistic choice is, in some cases, a trade off, right? On the one hand, it makes the album enveloping. On the other hand, it can sometimes make it feel underwritten. That patchwork quality sometimes can keep songs from congealing as wholes, or it can keep them from building to a climax. And things do sometimes tend to drift by without sticking. I know that I keep talking about dream logic in this album, but for me, listening to this album again often has, in fact, kind of the half-remembered familiarity of a dream. And in a couple of cases, style ends up working against content. So, for instance, the opening of the song Simple Pleasures is built around a couple of very simple but remarkably affecting, beautiful melodies. Latimer's vocals really perfectly evoke a mixture of melancholy and nostalgia and love. But the middle section ditches that mood and is built around a solo that doesn't generate a lot of momentum. So there's a wonderful song at the core, but the proggier aspects of the way that it's constructed actually end up acting to its detriment. Also, because a lot of the album does drift by, the occasional really notable misstep, like the fake Cockney accent on the song Fox Hill, tends to stand out more than it might otherwise. One thing I've said a few times is that Latimer tends to be tasteful almost to a fault. And it doesn't, he doesn't go overboard with weirdness the way that a lot of other prog artists occasionally might. So it's admirable that in this case he actually did so, but it's not really enjoyable per se. Still, though, the overall mood of this album is really like a big warm blanket, right? And that's particularly notable because the late stuff, beginning with Dust and Dreams, the stuff from the later end of the catalog often actually tends to be quite bleak. Whereas this is sweet more often than it is bitter, and it has a perhaps melancholy, but at the same time contented twilight quality that really, I think, makes it a perfect end to their studio catalog. So this album was very disappointing to me on a first listen for a couple of reasons, which I hope you'll indulge me in rambling about. The first is that the AllMusic Guide review made it sound like this was their definitive work, which I'm not sure anybody would really actually characterize it as. The second is that the cover is quite weird and actually fairly disturbing. And the third is that it has two pretty accomplished keyboardists, right? So all those things gave it a sense of promise that on a first listen didn't quite hold up to. And to unlock this album, you have to forgive it a couple of things. The first is that, not unlike with the album Breathless, the most immediately noticeable aspects of the material are sometimes underwhelming in ways which can obscure the quality of the overall composition. The first track, Wait, is, I think, emblematic, right? That big opening riff and the chorus vocals have kind of a glossy, smooth, almost ELO-ish quality that can seem slick and soulless. And the song moves very fast without really ever rocking at all. But there's so much cool stuff in that song if you pay attention. The verse rhythm has this very nimble stop and start quality. The dueling Moog solos in the middle do take great advantage of the dual keyboardist format. Andy Ward is doing some of his best work here. Check out those very quick ride patterns during the first and third keyboard solos. The song Who We Are is another example. It has that big, lavish chorus with its kind of quasi-disco rhythm. And that is the most immediately attention-grabbing element. So if you hear this album once or twice and then glance at the track listing, then that piece can register as kind of being a big, sloppy, mainstreamy kind of ballad. But man, there's so much cool stuff that's actually going on in that song. There's the intro section with all the little details and how it's played, right? The acoustic harmonics, the way the piano weaves in and out of the main melody. And the use of strings is great here. I love those big dramatic string accents in the second verse. Or the way the intro melody comes back in at the end in a very tentative, melancholy way. The second obstacle for new listeners is that the tone is somewhat uneven, especially in the second half. You have some very moody, serious pieces sitting next to a couple of things which almost feel like novelty songs. Remote Romance being maybe the worst offender, but Neon Magic is also kind of an odd vibe for this band to be pursuing. The key to getting past that is really, once again, to listen more closely, right? The spastic, jerky arrangement in Remote Romance presages early Devo, almost. The sound crafting in that song is very creative. And if you want to be really generous, you can even read the lyric as a bizarrely prescient statement about the eventual emergence of online dating. If you're having trouble with this album, start with the song Hymn to Her, which is a really wonderful piece that, as the title suggests, elevates romantic love almost to a spiritual plane, with a fantastic build-up, really as many great musical details as you could ever hope for. And, if you can get on the wavelength of that song, which I think is maybe the piece that's most accessible here to very prog-oriented fans, then, once you feel like you've broken that song open, try the whole album again. And I think a lot of the things that make it effective, you'll eventually discover in other places on the overall work. And overall, I'd say that this is really the album where I, as a listener, traveled the farthest from an initial very negative response to, over time, finding many, many great things hidden just below the surface. So we're picking back up here with number 7, Rajaz. And, as someone who came to the catalog fully formed, this album really, to me, has been consistently pleasurable at a level that nearly matches their best work. And, the quality of writing and playing here really equals the best of what any prog band was doing in the 90s. This, of course, is the third album following the founding of Camel Productions and their departure from the normal label system. And a couple things happen here that really distinguish this. One is that this feels like it was done by more of a full band than, certainly more so than Dust and Dreams and Harbor of Tears, or really anything that they've done since Nude. And I mentioned when I was discussing Dust and Dreams and Harbor of Tears how much the sonic profile of those albums is dominated by synths, right? And how minimal the drums are. And this album, you have songs like Three Wishes and Lost and Found, which feel much more like a live band playing through songs with energy and precision. And in places on this album where the arrangements are based more on programmed drums or layered synths, that choice tends to be made because it is beneficial to the atmosphere of the song. So, for instance, the final encore, which has this kind of trudging, almost quasi-industrial rhythm that is really evocative of the slow train, the slow journey of a train of camels across the desert, as in the cover image. And relative to the last two albums, I think they're striking a very smart balance here by liberating themselves from the constraints of doing something that is strictly a concept album. A lot of the sonic and lyrical content and the song titling kind of gestures at that desert imagery from the cover, right? And that gives this album kind of a unity of aesthetic and style and mood. The whole thing kind of has this quality that is evocative of cool nighttime and starlight and desert sprawl. But that also leaves room for something like Straight to My Heart, where Latimer talks about his youthful experiences with music in a very compelling way that, for me as a listener, really makes me feel a lot of affection for him. So this is a wonderful album. It's suffused with late night atmosphere. It's suffused with the love of music. If you're a fan of the early work and you haven't heard anything since the mid to late 70s output, this is really about as good a starting point as I can imagine. So number 6 is Nude, and I obsessed over how to pronounce that title for a while because the main character is a Japanese soldier. So I wondered if it was pronounced Nude, to seem more like in line with how one would pronounce the Japanese word. But, I looked up a few other videos and everybody else seems to say nude, so I guess I'm not embarrassing myself too badly by saying it that way. So number 6, we have Nude, and like Breathless, like I Can See Your House from Here, this is a mid-career piece that really has grown hugely in my estimation, but actually much more so even than those two albums, which, as great as I think they are, this is really the most effective, I think, of the post-Rain Dance's work. And this is an album that is very easy to overlook because it is just so subtle. It's so quiet, and in general, Camel tend toward restraint and subtlety more than a lot of other classic prog, like I said at the beginning of this video, but that's even more the case than usual here. There aren't really any big flashy instrumental sections. There are occasional leads, but there aren't any big solos, and some of the instrumental pieces in the middle, like landscapes and changing places, are so gentle, so quiet, that they almost edge toward the territory of ambient music. And another reason this album is easily overlooked, I think, is that the concept is quite hard to make out if you're not actually reading along with the booklet, right? There are some places where the story is told via lyrics. It starts out primarily being told lyrically, so it's reasonable to expect that you'll get the whole thing from the lyrics. But, then a lot of the key events in the album are either expressed instrumentally or via sound effects, right? So it's a little bit hard to calibrate what level of attention you need to pay to be following the narrative. And, maybe some people don't have any problem with that. But I am, as I've mentioned before on the channel, I am kind of a lyrics guy. I pay a lot of attention to lyrics on any album, but particularly a conceptual piece like this, right? And, the first few years I was listening to this album, I didn't have a hard copy with a booklet, and I just found it a challenge to calibrate the right level and the right type of attention. But, with the right level of attention, with careful scrutiny of the lyrics, with reading in the booklet how the different parts of the album relate to the story, I eventually found this to be actually maybe Latimer's most effective, emotionally effective writing of his whole career, right? Some of the later stuff is instrumentally more accomplished or more interesting in certain ways, but there's something I think that is moving about this album, maybe more so than anything else he's done. The songs City Life and Drafted and Lies, they have this kind of, this calm, melancholy dignity that feels like it comes right out of Latimer's soul, even though he's portraying a character who is culturally very removed from him. And the full band instrumental pieces, they're played well, but the focus is on careful composition and elegance and really moving melody. So, put the headphones on, read along with the booklet, and this album, it evokes a sense of spiritual calm and of the fragile beauty of life. And even though, again, the story is in some ways very remote from the band's experience, at the same time, I think it is completely aware of the trade-offs that we make to get through our day and, of the contradictions of the human soul. And it really luxuriates in the bittersweetness of being human and being alive. And I really do love this album very deeply. So number 5, I have Rain Dances, and we're right on the cusp here between things which take some effort and attention to appreciate and things that are just self-evidently great at first encounter. And this seems to be the first of the Camel albums that is not universally loved in the way that things like Snow Goose and Mood Madness are. And, there are a few reasons why I can see that would be. You have the first of the lineup shifts here that would really kind of hurt the band's long-term consistency. There aren't any long songs, which is often kind of a danger sign on a progressively oriented album like this. Highways to the Sun is kind of an okayish track where we start to find out that Latimer's voice maybe isn't as suited to concise, relatively poppy songs. And, on the second side of this album, every individual song is great, but they don't necessarily build to a compelling finale in the same way that the second halves of Mirage or Mood Madness did. And, it's going to be variable to the individual how much any of those things are significant as flaws. But because of those qualities, I did for years treat this as kind of an afterthought to the classic period. And what I've really come to believe now is that the change in personnel with the addition of Sinclair really brings in a different flavor that alters the vibe in a way that creates something that really isn't like anything else that they've ever done. And if it's not quite at the realm of the classic stuff, it's still a really, really brilliant album in its own right. And it's lovely to encounter Sinclair's voice here because he's in this album, he's placed in a moodier, dreamier atmosphere that really brings out a different character to what he does than the more whimsical context of Caravan, right? And so there's a flavor that's created by that merger that I don't think really appears anywhere else in either the catalog of Camel or Caravan. Just as an aside, I was going to single out a couple songs here as being especially good examples of Sinclair's bass playing. I was going to mention Tell Me, where there's some really fluid melodic bass lines, and the bass part to Skylines, which is really key to the kind of structure of that song. But then I happened to reread the booklet, and turns out Latimer played both those bass parts. So thank goodness that I checked that before I humiliated myself publicly. You also, of course, have Mel Collins here and a couple other secondary instrumentalists, and I think their presence is very key as well. My personal favorite example is the trombone and flugelhorn on Skylines. They're such a wonderful, subtle textural addition. They're one of those things that that sound in that song, it registers almost at a subliminal level. It's just barely in consciousness. And at the same time, is so important to the mood of what that song pulls off. And the perfect situation for this album really is, if you're having kind of a late morning drowse on an overcast, maybe rainy morning, and you're a little bit hungover. And that's actually a set of circumstances that I found myself in fairly regularly at the time I was really getting into this album. So, your mileage may vary depending on where you live and what your personal habits are, but I think it's a really fantastic piece that finds a little bit of a different angle on a lot of what made the classic stuff great. All right, that concludes part 2. I should have part 3 up in a couple weeks. Thanks much, everybody, for your time and attention. And as always, if you have it in you to like and or subscribe, that does help motivate me to keep going. Check out Electric Brain, Electric Shadow on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service. And hope everybody has a good spring.